Good afternoon, everyone. So tens of thousands of public servants from 160 countries go on to Apolitical to try and find answers to big questions they have. And do you know what one of the most common questions is? It's, how do I work with innovative companies to better solve big problems we face? So there's this massive desire across the world on the part of government to better work with companies, and yet the level at which that's happening does not match that desire. So this panel is all about asking why that's the case, what needs to be done to change it, and what frameworks are going to be put in place here in Estonia to make that dream a reality. But before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to get a sense from you about what you think the state of play is. So can everybody in the room stand up? Stand up. Last session of the day, let's get the blood rushing, yeah. Shake it out, shake it out. Let's get the energy high. OK, so if you are a public servant, sit down. Everyone else stay standing. OK, so not many public servants in the room. If you are a startup or an investor, keep standing. Everybody else sit down. OK, startups and investors in the room. If you work on any of the issues on the board, or work on issues that are equal in magnitude and seriousness for humanity, stay standing. Everybody else sit down. You've illustrated my point. So this whole session is about how more startups are going to be working on these things. Right, everybody can take a seat. Now, public servants in the room, there were a few of you. How many of you have worked with a startup in order to solve a challenge that you're working on? Raise your hand. OK, so most of the public servants in the room have actually done that, but they're a minority, clearly. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Evan Burfield, who is the author of Regulatory Hacking and the CEO of Union, to tell us a little bit about how startups can succeed in highly regulated environments. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you so much. How do I? Oh, there we go. It is incredibly easy to forget as I look out in the audience and see fully half of you guys staring at these things, that the iPhone was only invented barely 10 years ago. If you now think about all of the things that those of you who are looking at your phones right here today are able to do, it's pretty mind-blowing. You can access information from all around the world. You can keep track of what your family and friends are doing. You can self-publish your thoughts in real time to an audience that can opt in. You can find a date. You can order food on demand. You can access mobility as a service, and thousands of other things. And it's not just over the last 10 years. Broadly, over the last 20 years, we have seen a tremendous impact in our lives through the application of digital technologies. But it's worth noting, when we look at, for example, what the biggest venture-backed exits of the last 20 years have been, in fact, how concentrated that impact has been. So this is it. This is the list of the biggest VC-backed exits. Actually, this was done before Uber went public on Friday, so we can throw that up on the board. But this is the list. And if you really think about it and look at it, the vast majority of the wealth creation, the vast majority of the impact has really been in two areas. Number one, how do we consume goods and services? How do we buy things? And number two, how do we consume information? We have spent 20 years applying unbelievable digital technologies to our lives as consumers. But there's something else that should jump out at you about much of this list, which is we've had an incredible concentration in where people are building startups and who is getting to build startups. And it can at times feel like if many of our startups are being built within a 100-mile radius of Stanford by 26-year-olds wearing hoodies who are living living away from home for the first time, that many of the startups that we see around us are the kinds of things that seem like the biggest problem you can imagine if you're a 26-year-old living away from your parents for the first time, right? There was this whole stretch for a while a few years ago where there were like tens of millions of dollars all being poured into startups that could get your laundry done for you on demand. And it always occurred to me that there were a bunch of founders sitting there somewhere in Silicon Valley who were like, oh shit, I don't actually know how to do my laundry, so I'm going to invent a startup to get this done for me. But for all of this unbelievable innovation, for all of this incredible wealth creation and impact on our lives, we really haven't done much for a family like this. If you're a single parent with kids living somewhere in a city in the world, right, a lot of the issues that really define your quality of life, that define your ability to advance yourself and your children are things like, how do I actually get across town to 2 different jobs and get my kids picked up? Right? It's transportation. How do I get healthy food on the table inexpensively and conveniently? Right? How do I actually educate myself so that I can advance economically? And even more importantly, how do I make sure my kids are getting access to the education that's going to enable them to succeed in a rapidly changing world? How do I access healthcare? Right? These are actually the things that define the quality of life for the vast majority of the world, much more so than dating apps and laundry delivery services. The good news is that era really has come to an end. And when I wrote the book Regulatory Hacking and I first put this slide deck together, I used to have to say this era is coming to an end, but I feel confident now in saying definitively it has come to an end. And we have entered a very different era of innovation. And the most defining trait of this era, and you take a step back and think about it, is that we've left a period of time in which innovation was almost intentionally focused in the areas as far as possible from gatekeepers and rule makers and government, and we're entering an era of innovation in which the wealth creation and the impact on our lives is going to come from building startups and new technologies that in fact are going squarely at government and regulation. And that skill set is going to be what defines many of the generational successes to come. But before I get into what that skill set looks like, I want to talk a little bit about some of the really important trends that are driving this shift. The first, which we talked about, is that where you can build startups, and implicitly then who can build startups, is changing, right? You guys all feel this every day around you. We're in Tallinn. We're in an incredibly vibrant, exciting place that has an active startup ecosystem, and you can raise capital, and you can get access to expertise, and you can tap into global markets. And you just couldn't do that in the same way 5 years ago or certainly 10 years ago. But it's not just Tallinn or Dubai or Toronto or Washington, D.C. I was in Harare, Zimbabwe a year ago. And at least from an American perspective, it's sort of an iconic example of a failed state, right? You have 80% unemployment, you have massive corruption. And I wasn't exactly sure what I expected, but I got off the airplane, and within an hour, I was at an incubator, an accelerator. I was meeting angel investors who were writing checks into incredible entrepreneurs who were accessing all of the same tools and applying all of the same techniques that a startup that I might work with in New York or Washington, D.C. was. But what was fascinating was they weren't solving the same kinds of problems, because if you're an entrepreneur sitting in Harare, Zimbabwe, the most important problem you can think about are things like, there's a really good probability that my bank is going to fail and I will lose all my savings, so how do I build apps that allow me to conduct financial transactions more efficiently and move my savings into a place that is not subject to the vagaries and whims of an unstable banking system? The extreme version of that for me is this startup you see right here, Twiga. They're my absolute favorite startup, not just because they're a great example of everything we're talking about, and not just because they are a incredibly inspiring team, but because they're the largest position now in our venture portfolio, and I'm really counting on them to fund my retirement. So I talk about them every chance I can get. And again, this is an incredibly interesting team based in Nairobi, Kenya. And they really studied the question of food inflation, which is probably the single most urgent public policy problem in sub-Saharan Africa. The average middle-class Kenyan urban Kenyan spends over 50% of their income on basic foodstuffs. And that is continuing to drive, that inflation is continuing to drive up year after year. So the fascinating thing was they looked at this problem and they realized that it wasn't actually a farm problem so much as it was a data problem. They put smartphone apps in the hands of all the mamambogas, the informal street vendors, where 85% of all commerce in sub-Saharan Africa flows through. They aggregated all the demand information. They put in place long-term supply relationships with farmers. They were able to implement modern infrastructure for shipping. And in less than 4 years now, 50% of all fresh fruits and vegetables and fast-moving consumer goods in Nairobi flows through the Twiga system, bringing costs down for consumers, creating more stability for farmers. And again, they were taking the same kinds of technologies, big data, mobile phones, all of these things, but applying it to a very different problem because they were in a different place and they were different founders and they saw different issues. The second trend is simply that a lot of the low-hanging fruit is gone, right? If you were an entrepreneur 10, 15 years ago and you looked around and realized you could make $1 billion by creating a dating app, you probably were going to focus on that instead of, I'm going to need to go transform clinical workflows in a hospital setting. That seems really hard. But a lot of that low-hanging fruit has been plucked now. I'm sure there are some entrepreneurs here in Tallinn who have some brilliant idea on a way to share a photograph better than Instagram or Snapchat or whatever else. And more power to you. You might be able to succeed, but you're going to have to go through an incredible amount of capital and an incredible amount of talent that is focused obsessively on that single problem over and over and over again. Right? Maybe you have a great idea on how to share music better, but you know what? Spotify at this point is a pretty damn refined solution to that problem. When you look at most of these problems that fundamentally involve our lives as consumers, they feel like they have been solved. Whereas, at least as an American, wander into your doctor's office and in about the first 15 minutes, you will have no lack of multi-billion-dollar problems to solve. They're there, they're obvious. They're driven by massive inefficiencies. But to solve those problems, you're going to have to work through a tremendous amount of complexity, and you're going to have to deal with an awful lot of regulation and collaboration with government. The third trend is that, again, as we talked about, the big problems that are left, right? And in fact, our lives as citizens account for more like 80% of the global economy. These are giant problems. These problems that are left are all inherently complex, right? This is the UN Sustainable Development Goals is a good proxy, right? So it's problems like innovation and infrastructure, good health, quality education, right? All of these problems at their core are ones that are incredibly tightly regulated by government. And they are incredibly tightly regulated by government, regardless of your ideology or what political system you operate under, because they are important. Either because they define the essential attributes that you need to live a quality life, or because they present really meaningful risks. Right? As a student of history, any Roman emperor that failed to secure the grain supply from Egypt wasn't a Roman emperor for very long. Any government that doesn't play a strong role in making sure that food and health and education and transportation are provided well in their country won't remain a government for long. The fourth trend, which is important, is that we have, certainly in the United States and to a large extent globally, come through a very unique period of permissionless innovation. The internet, these digital technologies were so exciting that we decided that startups should almost be given a free pass. They should be given the benefit of the doubt. They should be allowed to move fast and break things. But we're now at a point in time where we're starting to actually understand some of the things that were broken during that period. Maybe social media is incredibly interesting and powerful and cool, but also really unhealthy for us. Maybe a Silicon Valley culture that's obsessed on making sure you're incredibly addicted to products is causing you to be incredibly addicted to products, right? Maybe this isn't good for democracy. And as we ask these questions about the impact that these have had in our lives as consumers, it's going to usher in a very different approach to how we think about regulating and putting guardrails around these new technologies applied to our lives as citizens. The final trend, which is driving a lot of this, is just the reality that stuff's about to get freaky, right? I see startups now that are going, hey, I am putting a billion parallel connections in the human brain so that a paraplegic can power an exoskeleton and walk around. I'm like, wow, that is amazing, but like, didn't I see that in the movie Aliens and Avatar? And isn't that like central to the premise of The Matrix, right? We talk about autonomous vehicles, and we saw in 10 years there'll be autonomous vehicles on the road. That's cool, but these are 3,000-pound weapons driving through our neighborhoods controlled by a computer. I love my Model 3. It's an amazing vehicle. I think autopilot is insanely cool. It should not be allowed to be legal on roads right now. It isn't safe. It may be safe 99.99% of the time, but that 1 in 10,000 shots a doozy, right? We do need to think in a very robust way about how we regulate these technologies. If we're now able to use CRISPR to start modifying life forms on a home computer, we need to think about that in a real way. All of these technologies can drive unbelievable transformative impact in our lives. They can make the science fiction we grew up reading as kids real, but they are also unbelievably risky. So what does all this mean if you're a startup founder? Well, it means that the battery is in fact mattering less. And for those of you who don't know, if you go to raise venture capital in Silicon Valley and you're good at it, at some point you're going to have to meet a VC at the battery. It's the private club that all the VCs hang out at. And if you're the founder, you have to sort of stand there at the front desk like a schlub until like the VC has told them you can be allowed in. And you sit there and you're meeting with one VC and you look around and you see all the other cool VCs. And in fact, right, that collection, that small collection, that network of people sitting at the battery in the heart of San Francisco can control the allocation of ungodly amounts of capital. Right? One of the really popular books out there right now is Reid Hoffman's Blitzscaling. It's sort of the applied version of 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. And it essentially argues that if you raise massive amounts of capital, you can absorb huge losses until you've created a monopoly. And then once you have a monopoly, you can extract excessive rents from consumers, right? This is the ultimate manifestation of sort of Silicon Valley wisdom and thinking at the moment. And when we were really just focused on our lives as consumers, Silicon Valley alone, the battery alone, could drive an awful lot of that behavior. But all of a sudden, as we move into the regulatory era, boring old City Hall is suddenly becoming relevant again. Do you guys have the little electric scooters in Tallinn yet? Okay. So in Washington, D.C., it was amazing, because it was like one day there were no electric scooters, and then it was like we woke up the next morning, and there were thousands and thousands of them everywhere, and you could barely walk down the sidewalk without tripping over an electric scooter. And the first time I rode one, I got onto it, and I was like late for a meeting, and I'm zipping through the streets with the wind in my hair, and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, this is the future of last mile transformation. This is going to transform how we get around cities. This is so cool. And then a week later, I'm walking down a sidewalk, and I've got my 18-month-old son in my little carrying pack, and I've got my 3-year-old daughter's hand, and some jackass 25-year-old on a scooter goes zipping right past me, and my first instinct was to sort of shoulder check him into the street. My second instinct was, we need to like ban these things. Where is the regulation? How can this be allowed on our streets and sidewalks? Both of those are true. Well, electric scooters can be incredibly transformative. Flying cars can be incredibly transformative. They should also have appropriate rules around them to make sure that they, in fact, operate in the public interest and respect the lots of different equities that need to use urban sidewalks. And the interesting thing with the scooters was that these scooter companies, which are still like barely 2 years old, They all raised hundreds of million dollars within like 6 months. Incredible amounts of capital. Classic Silicon Valley blitz scaling. We're all going to compete through just sheer capital to see who can create a monopoly fastest. And then that all came screeching to a halt as soon as city halls figured out exactly the same thing I did, which is, whoa, we're going to regulate these. And San Francisco banned scooters. And Silicon Valley went, this is the greatest breach of justice that any society has ever felt. How can you hate innovation? How can you hate progress? How can you hate these scooters? And then they sat there and waited about 6 months until San Francisco had figured out the right regulatory regime, and then they allowed, in a regulated fashion, those scooters to operate. As we move into areas where our lives, as citizens, can be significantly impacted by these new technologies, you have to understand how to navigate City Hall. There are some principles to think about how you do that. The first is that experimentation is still important. Right? One of the great insights, I think, in building startups over the last 20 years in this era of consumer was the idea of sort of the lean startup. Distill that down, it basically says, don't build a startup like an engineer. Don't go out and say, I know what my amazing product is going to look like. I'm going to build a blueprint for it. I'm going to develop a project plan. I'm going to raise capital. I'm going to march through that. And then I'm going to release my product. And consumers will flock to me because of the amazingness of my product. And the problem with that, as any investor would tell you, is that you're almost certainly wrong, and not just a little bit wrong, but very wrong. And by the time you figure out you're wrong, you will have burned a lot of capital and wasted a lot of time. Instead, operate like a scientist. Experiment, test, put forward hypotheses, figure out the fastest, cheapest way that you can get real, hard evidence as to whether those are true or not, and continue to refine and refine and refine until you have discovered a customer, a problem, a product, a business model that in fact can scale. That experimentation is only more important if you are a regulatory hacker attempting to deploy a technology solving one of these complex problems, because there are so many more variables that you have to solve for. Now you don't just have to solve a problem for a customer, a problem, a product, a business model, but also how is it going to interact with public interest? How am I going to deal with the appropriate rules and boundaries that government may put on this? The difference, though, is that now we're not just experimenting around what my customer needs, right? That's one of the other great insights from sort of the lean startup is obsess, obsess, obsess over your customer. Instead, you have to actually think through your complete power map. One of the startups in our venture portfolio is a company called Baby Scripts. And this is a US startup that does, and their original sort of insight was, hey, we're going to enable an app and a set of sort of home devices to allow expectant moms to sort of track their pregnancy. Right? So there would be a wireless scale, a wireless blood pressure cuff, a little home ultrasound device. It'll all read back to my phone app, and it'll tell the expectant mom if she has any signals that would indicate a high-risk condition in pregnancy. So they tried that at first and figured out really fast that giving an expectant mom the ability to get signals that she might have high-risk conditions was a decidedly uncomfortable thing if it wasn't connected directly back to her doctor so that she had someplace to go and collaborate. Great. So the customer is the doctor. Well, sort of, except, at least in the US, the doctor doesn't really do much. It's actually the nurse who's the one who's actually using the data and looking at all this and really only brings the doctor in if there's a real issue. Cool. So that's my customer, except, again, in the US, most obstetric practices are now owned by massive health systems. So in fact, I have to go to the administrator of the health system and figure out the problem that he or she wants. Really, in the US, that problem is they want to figure out what the insurance company or the government payer wants, right? And somewhere in there, there's probably a regulator who cares about the flow of private data. And in the US, there's an entire industry association of obstetricians, and if you don't get them on board, an obstetrician is not allowed to use a device if it doesn't conform to their standards. So who's your customer if you're Baby Scripts? Right? If you don't add value, or at least not create a problem for pretty much everyone in that chain, you have no business. Right? Complex, highly regulated markets are inherently multi-stakeholder. That is the essence of the challenge and the problem. And that means instead of being obsessive about experimenting and understanding your customer, you have to be obsessive in experimenting about understanding the complete power map that you are dealing with so that you can actually find the regulatory hacks that will enable you to unlock the full potential of your startup. Another key principle, right? Data is unbelievably important. If you are genuinely developing a technology that has a massive impact or presents a significant risk, you are going to have to present a lot of proof. Was an angel investor in a dating app. Did really well, and I got these awesome investor reports every month, and I would learn about engagement and the number of conversations that were occurring, the number of matches that were made, and all this incredibly cool data. But I never got any data that said, and by the way, we've done a peer-reviewed study to show that marriages 10 years on after being created by our app are more successful than marriages that were not created by our app. We don't expect that level of proof because it's not that important. Whereas, appropriately, if you're going to put a technology in place to say this is a better way to educate our children, you are in fact going to have to show that it produces better learning outcomes for children than what you're displacing. And you should. And that will take more time. And you have to devise how you're going to build a startup around this idea of how do you gather the data and how do you create the proof. If we look... Sure. Yep, jump on up.
Brilliant. Can I also introduce to the stage your Deputy Secretary General for Economic Development, Viljar Lubi. Thank you so much, Evan, for a really engaging keynote. You're over there.
Me to come there?
Great.
Okay.
No, this is good, this is good. So Evan, your whole presentation was absolutely excellent at showing how startups are going to be solving different problems, and you were sort of giving a handbook, like tips on what they would need to think about in order to do that. This links in with your vision, Viljar, for Accelerate Estonia. So perhaps you could give us a brief explanation of what that is, and we can go into how we can apply Evan's insights into that.
I try. First, I apologize. Probably I'm in deep trouble because I haven't read your book yet. Anyway, first I need to complain. I will give you something you probably know already. I complain, meaning that the life of a civil servant is a very difficult one. It is a difficult one because, as you know, we have to write together many strategies on governmental level. But strategies, as you know, governments cannot fail, meaning you have to eliminate all the risks. So there cannot be any risks in the strategy. By default, if you eliminate all the risks, there is no profit. So this is the one big shortcoming of the public service. Other one is that you did a good exercise here, showing who are all the people here in the room. That my biggest struggle in the office is that I try to focus, have maybe 4 to 5 topics on my desk, but the daily life is completely different. I have hundreds of them. Because, everybody in this room thinks that whenever government is needed, that your problem is the biggest one, that public sector needs to address. So meaning that, in the public sector, everything is equally important. That's the biggest difference, I would say, between the private sector and public sector. In public sector, everything is equally important. And that really creates a problem, because we really struggle in delivering. And this we thought that, let's say, all the countries, all the governments try to address the same problem, that politicians, their attention span is too short and very extremely wide, how to narrow it down so that actually we don't only have an idea, but also implement it. So we thought, we use public sector accelerator called Accelerate Estonia in order to really focus on a few areas and just deliver as well. So how to come from the idea to the market as well. What is important also, Accelerate Estonia is not the GovTech accelerator. It's a public-private partnership, meaning that we want to create a market so that actually governments also are business-oriented. We want to really do business, earn money together with the private sector, mostly indirectly, and we have to work hand in hand with the private sector. So Accelerate Estonia tries to solve this issue. The best example probably is, I see my colleague there, Ott, who is head of e-residency. I don't know how many of you are e-residents already who are not Estonians. How it started, first, you needed an idea. Idea was there for a while, then you need a team. We found a few extremely motivated senior people in the government, and then they made extremely important decision. they employed the project leader. Kaspar Korjus was employed, and his only focus was how to get the idea, the first prototype. Then it was like in private sector, he had to do the pitch. Everybody was, wow, taken aback, let's do it, invested more money and more time. So it was this is some success story that actually delivered, and the idea was transformed to a prototype that can be sold on the market. But with the e-residency, as you know, the public sector role doesn't disappear. We have to be there. So that we try to focus on the same kind of ideas, that by doing less, we actually do more. How that government chooses a few ideas and really works hand in hand with the private sector and tries to create a market.
So one thing that startups really struggle with is access to funding.
Yep.
We're a GovTech startup ourselves trying to solve a big problem. And if I'm being honest, when we tell most investors that we're looking to work with government, they run a mile. Lots of companies looking to invest in clean tech are struggling to raise funding in the way that a dating app might. What's going to, in this particular case, and maybe in other cases from your experience, Evan, how do we solve this access to funding point?
I mean, I think it's still harder, but it has changed a lot. I mean, so it is not as hard as it used to be. I still remember when I would talk to sort of mainline venture capitalists who'd go, oh, we're just not going to invest in anything that has any regulatory risk or touches government at all. If you look at Andreessen Horowitz's portfolio, you have actually a whole host of startups that are now directly serving government or raising money from government. I think, though, it's also incumbent on entrepreneurs to think a little bit more creatively about where that funding comes from and what it looks like. There's such an emphasis now on if it's not venture capital, somehow I'm not cool enough, or it's not real. One of the most interesting startups, the one that I referenced in the talk, Paradromics, which is doing the brain computer interface startup. They raised $1 million in venture capital. And then they went out and they got a $20 million phase 1 grant from the US Department of Defense and said, hey, we think there's massive applications for this technology, but let's start with seeing if this can actually help quadriplegic, paraplegic soldiers that were injured in war walk again and move again and function again, and can we do that more efficiently? And the interesting part about that hack is, number one, it was non-dilutive funding, significant non-dilutive funding that had kind of a different emphasis to it than VC might. Second part is that in the US context, if you're working with the Department of Defense, you can get waivers from the FDA on doing human trials for medical devices much faster than you could if you're not. And so it was both a funding hack, and it was also wow, these can be strategically helpful for us in getting to market faster and experimenting faster. And whether that's thinking through the role of family offices and impact funds, whether it's thinking through strategic investment, whether it's looking at government funding, I often encourage entrepreneurs to not be so kind of mono-focused on, the big, flashy, sexy VC.
Completely agree. And in an Estonian context, how do you think that plays out, Viljar, especially with this initiative?
I even would say that it's a very bold statement, but money is not the issue. I think, if you take these kind of initiatives, then from the public sector point of view, I think the problems are exactly the same. I'm not an investor myself, I'm a public servant. But in order the idea to succeed, you need two things. First is market, other is team. And team is crucial in this case also. Unless you have a motivated team, nothing flies. I give you an example that, why probably countries like Estonia, small countries especially, we need to pick our fights. We cannot, fight all the wars at the same time. Even the big countries can't. I was posted to Washington, D.C. Even countries like US cannot fight two wars at the same time, literally speaking. So that you need to focus. And small countries, we need to pick our fights and focus and deliver. And small countries, we want to, of course, compete with all the other countries, because we don't live in an isolated world. Everybody thinks, we have the upper hand on a very sexy topic, so that it's a time-sensitive thing. I mean, you have to move fast. Governments need to move fast. So that in order to do that, we need to keep our focus on that all the ministries need to work for the same target. And now comes the key element, the team. Let's say that if you just, calculate where is the biggest potential market, maybe the sexy topics like AI or self-driving cars, whatever. But unless, government needs to invest first. Unless government invests first, no private sector services will follow. So government needs to take a risk first. That's the key, that we put our house in order. And unless you have a strong ownership of the topic, let's say self-driving cars, if my colleague from transport, top-level civil servant, is not on board, nothing happens. Even if it's on paper, this is the sexiest, most lucrative idea.
Right.
It doesn't fly. So we have to focus on things that actually we can deliver, and also from the public sector's point of view, the team is there, motivated team.
So both of you have given really good examples of where government as a first customer or government as a first supporter is so critical to helping startups in these really complex challenges thrive. Now, there are lots of elements to ensuring that government is comfortable with it, one, and two, that government can actually benefit from having been that first investor or that first customer. So data sharing agreements or revenue sharing agreements. What are the sorts of things that, Viljar, you foresee as kind of being essential pieces of that infrastructure to make Accelerate Estonia be successful for government as well as the startups?
Two things, but also we came to London to learn from colleagues, your colleagues as well, and understand it better. So actually the approach for the public sector is very similar to the private sector. So that first really understand what the problem is. And the problem is, in our case, we know it's not only Estonia's case, everywhere, that that we don't keep focus. Government needs to keep focus that, pick only few fights and all the ministries work on it and let the idea fail. This is very tricky thing for the public sector, as you know, governments cannot fail. It's easy to start policies, it's very difficult to end them. So let them fail also. So meaning that we have to keep it very, let's say, open to the market forces. Also what I ask from e-residency team members, that it's a pet project of Estonian government, but it's a collaboration with the private sector. But let's assume right now it's mostly financed or fully financed from the public sector. Let's assume that our owners are private investors. Would they be happy right now? I think this we have to keep in mind as well. Would they still keep financing the e-residency projects? So that we really have to focus, and then we have to keep the team there, and because unless the team delivers, nothing will happen, and let really the projects die, because this is crucial. So we try to keep high-level civil servants extremely motivated. We keep the politicians on the radar all the time. Not too often, but not too seldom also, because they need to have the ownership as well. It is not easy, as you know, that usually those sexy topics are not the mainstream policies that have the strongest influence to the wider audience and the electorate. Yeah. So that's why, they don't always support you because their problems lie elsewhere. So I think, also how high up in the radar we keep our politicians, it's very, very important. But probably what I want to say is that our aim is to repeat, let's say, the success of Estonian startups. I think it was quite essential, the success story of Skype, and then what followed after that. The Skype that was created here in Estonia was so instrumental that, it's so important that all the other success stories in the Estonian startup field followed. So hopefully, this public-private partnership that was original was in order to create the market, because a lifetime is getting nomadic, that e-residency, that maybe with e-residency we can create another success stories with other public-private partnerships like that.
Evan, can you give us you've given us a good example of where this public-private partnership has really worked. Can you give us an example of where it's not worked?
I mean, I think those are vast. I think we've certainly seen a lot of the things we've seen in Washington, D.C., for example, a lot of the 1776 startups. I think there can be a tendency sometimes on the part of policymakers earnestly to sort of want to be nice and want to be helpful. And there's an earnest and inspiring startup, and it's a great story, and it's a good founder. And those almost always fail. And one of the things that I think is true, and it took me a while to sort of figure this out as I sort of started investing as a venture capitalist, is that it's not my job as a VC to be nice. It's my job to be supportive, and it's my job to provide advice and guidance. But like, there's a brutality to this, right? We started out in our current fund with 40 companies in the portfolio, and the vast majority of our capital is now deployed in 5, which meant that each round through that, we were culling and going, we've had a chance to put a little bit of money into you, we've worked with you for a little while, and we have concluded we're not going to put more money into you. And that sort of, and I always talk to entrepreneurs who sort of ask these questions, like, I receive inbound without doing anything, literally thousands and thousands. Like, in the run-up to this conference, I probably received pitch decks from 15 or 20 startups here in Estonia, and I'm not here to invest, and I'm not even here to have that conversation. Like, the amount of inbound, and so you have to be unbelievably brutal in making that decision, and I think you're definitely not making it on the basis of, well, you're earnest and you're nice and you're inspiring, and I want to be helpful, so let me give you a little bit of money. The inverse of that, though, I mean, I often, it's very popular, I think, in the startup world to like bemoan how horrible government is. And oh, they don't get it, no, they're so out of touch, and oh, they're so bureaucratic, and like, it's cool, because we're here in Estonia, which is legitimately probably the most innovative, forward-leaning, progressive government out there, right? But most startups, most of the places in the world, basically think government is like hopelessly out of touch. That's dumb, and I really, really push back on entrepreneurs with that. It's not that government is out of touch or dumb or doesn't get it. It's that they have a very different set of incentives. If you look at the typical public or policymaker, right, they have an extremely asymmetric set of incentives. If they go and say, you know what, your flying car, super cool, just put that out there and let's see what happens, and that flying car falls from the sky on a family, what's going to happen to that policymaker? They are going to be absolutely pilloried.
Yep.
In the media, they are going to be held up as an example of everything that is horrible and wrong, and their careers will be ruined, and their personal reputations will be ruined. Now, let's suppose they put that flying car out there and it works.
Nothing good.
Yeah, policymaker,
No one gets promoted
the flying
for
car
that.
company may make $1 billion. The policymaker, at their next review cycle will get the next incremental step raise, and nobody will even know they existed. So if you're an entrepreneur and you want to work with government, like, you have to recognize that reality.
Yeah.
Right? And you have to understand that you have to bring more data, and you have to understand how to align around the policymakers' priorities. And your priority may not be their priorities, and you have to actually do the work to tie what you're doing, as cool as it may be, back to the public interest. So, entrepreneurs have work to do to understand how to craft and shape what they're doing in a way that is digestible by government and measured in a way that can help step the risk for government. Same time, government needs to recognize they shouldn't be trying to sprinkle a little bit of money around a whole lot of companies and feel good about helping all of them, and they need to be a little bit more measured and focused in their priorities and recognize that most of these are high-risk companies that are going to fail.
Completely agree. So part of what we're doing at Apolitical is to help companies tell their stories with testimonials by other public servants in ways that make sense to public servants. And we're starting to share stories of how governments have thought really carefully about structuring their partnerships with these companies so that they're not just sort of giving nice grant funding, but are actually making that investment work for them because the benefits back to government could be so profound. So like a startup in the UK, for example, is cleaning up NHS data, and the government is cooperating in that because they'll be able to use that data back. I'm really sorry, we've run out of time, but just a few bits to end. One, your book is available where?
On Amazon.
On Amazon. And I think at the event tomorrow, which you're opening, Viljar.
Tomorrow morning, yes.
Event,
I heard it's all sold out. That Evan will be speaking there, I will be speaking there also. It's sold out, so it means it's very popular. but we will launch Accelerate Estonia, it meaning that e-Estonia, be worried because new groundbreaking ideas will be floated soon.
You've got an internal competitor. So to end, think about, can business actually solve these wicked problems? Like, is our startups the answer to this? Obviously, the answer is a little bit of both, but think about which end of the spectrum you are, if it was a yes or no. People who think, no, it's not all business, government has to take a steadier hand, raise your hand. And people who think startups can save the world.
We'll
end with the startups. Round of applause. Thank you so much for your time.